Good evening, everyone. I'm Dan Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin. I get to say that at the beginning of the semester. And I want to thank you for joining us for tonight's Richard C. Holbrooke lecture, the first fellows lecture of our fall 2024 semester. And it will be delivered by Professor Michael Kimmage. And it is really a pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. And it's really a great to have such a full house. This has been a remarkable week at the Academy as our semester gets into full swing, and I guess that it could best be described as a sandwich with two slices of Kimmage and a big slab of Schwarzenegger in the middle. Which is to say that Tuesday the Academy had the unusual and quite remarkable experience of hosting a reception for the governor himself. He was in town, as many of you have seen in the press, to receive an honorary doctorate from the Hertie School of Government. It was a pretty unforgettable event, and Arnold has a terrific sense of humor and real star power, and it momentarily distracted us from the world's most pressing problems. Our speaker tonight was also there, and I will be interested to see if this encounter with the human superpower, a man who tolerates no nuance, will have affected our speaker in any way. Perhaps we'll get extraordinarily decisive policy recommendations, more declaratory language, and a refusal to distinguish between the shades of gray. Well, we shall see. But before Arnold, back on Monday night, we did focus on one of the foremost problems of our time, and that is, of course, the continuing war in Ukraine. And Michael Kimmage gave a keynote speech on the conflict at the Staatsbibliothek on Unter den Linden. I can see that a few of you were there. And then he participated in a really interesting panel discussion with the Ukrainian ambassador Makeyev and Barbara Lippert of Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. And at the heart of that discussion were European and American responses to the Russian invasion. And so you could say Michael began the semester's discussion of Ukraine in medias res, in the middle of the story, as all great epics do. But that talk left us wanting much more. And tonight he will move further back in time to give us the beginning of the story as he speaks on the origins of the war in Ukraine. Anyway, I should add that I'm especially pleased Michael's here to continue this discussion because it has been going on here at the Academy since the invasion and has included talks by such scholars as Timothy Snyder, Serhii Plokhy, Arnie Westad, and many others. Let me just say a quick word about this fellowship. The Richard C. Holbrooke Forum was established in 2013, shortly after Richard Holbrooke's untimely death. And it was established to honor the American Academy in Berlin's founder and his lifelong commitment to applying the tools of diplomacy and statecraft to solving some of the world's most intractable problems. And the program aims to bring together some of the most influential thinkers and practitioners in global affairs to engage in candid and wide-ranging discussions about key issues facing the international community. In 2018, the fellowship, the Richard C. Holbrooke Fellowship, was inaugurated, and it included both a residency fellowship at the Academy as well as the leadership of the workshop with leaders from government, business, and academia to discuss the fellows' research from a variety of perspectives. Previous Holbrooke Fellows include Anne-Marie Slaughter and Andrew Moravchik, Elizabeth Economy, George Frampton, and others. And I want to thank the donors to the Richard C. Holbrooke Forum for their continued support in making this whole program and the fellowship possible. Okay, now to our speaker. Michael Kimmage is a terrific addition to that group of Holbrooke alumni. He is a professor, he has been a professor since 2005 at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., where he teaches the history of the Cold War, U.S.-Russian relations, and American diplomacy and intellectual history. He Also had a serious turn in government as a member of the Office for Policy Planning at the State Department, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio from 2014 to 2017. He has been a visiting professor at the Free University here in Berlin and has had visiting professorships as well in Vilnius and Munich. And he is a frequent visitor to Munich as a senior fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies at the Ludwig Maximilian University. Michael is a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. He has a variety of other affiliations. He has degrees from Oberlin, from Oxford, where he was a Marshall Scholar, and from Harvard. And last night, as I left the building, I thought I heard him play, was it a Schubert Sonata? Yeah, it was pretty damn good. In short, Michael Kimmage is, how can we say it, a true transatlantic prodigy. He has been focusing on the war in Ukraine from the moment it began. And on the second anniversary of the invasion, that is February 24th of this year, his most recent work was published by Oxford University Press. It is entitled Collisions, the Origins of the War in Ukraine and the New Global Instability. Of this book, our also very distinguished alum, Mary Serrati, said, drawing on his experience in both the academic and diplomatic worlds, Michael Kimmage has produced a beautifully written analysis of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and of the geopolitical false assumptions that it utterly shattered. I have to say, I'm agog at the range of Michael's scholarship. He is the author of The Conservative Turn, Lionel Trilling, Whittaker Chambers and the Lessons of Anti-Communism. He also wrote a book entitled The Abandonment of the West, The History of an Idea in American Foreign Policy. And I learned over dinner that he's also written a book about Philip Roth, all of which is pretty impressive. Anyway, he writes regularly for Foreign Affairs and the Wall Street Journal. And as we have found at the Academy in the most wonderfully surprising way, he is much sought after for public appearances throughout Germany because the phone is ringing off the hook. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Michael's lecture will last about 35 minutes, after which I will join him on stage for a discussion, which we will open up to you. And there will be, I'm sure, a lively question and answer. If you are here at the Academy, just raise your hand to ask a question in the traditional method. If you're joining us on our website, type your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of the page after, I'm told, accepting the pop-up. And now, without further ado, I would like to welcome Michael Kimmage to the podium. Michael, it's all yours.
Dan, thank you so much for that most generous introduction. I'd like to also thank all of the people here at the Academy for the extraordinary atmosphere that they create, and to thank the fellows for their enthusiasm, rigor, and extraordinarily wide range of interests. When you learn something at the breakfast table, you know it's serious, and they bring great spirits and seriousness alike to this place and to the work that I'm doing here, and I think that all of us are trying to do here. So the title of my lecture is The Origins of the War in Ukraine. And as the Richard C. Holbrooke Fellow here, I would like to honor the memory of Richard Holbrooke. And Dan has already alluded to one aspect of this, his commitment to problem solving, but I'd like to honor it in two respects. First of all, we know that Richard Holbrooke was an avid reader of history and felt that diplomacy had to be derived from an understanding of history. And we also know, even by the standards of diplomacy, or perhaps especially by the standards of diplomacy, that Richard Holbrooke was really dedicated to problem solving, not just to analyzing and thinking about problems, but to finding a way of resolving them. And I wish, I could speak with a kind of Holbrookian confidence about the problem that's for our consideration this evening, but I'll do my best, and that's what I'll return to in my conclusion. So just to outline the structure of my remarks, 4 parts to these remarks. The first, I'm going to go back in time, not to the early moments of the war in Ukraine, but to 1995, and to Richard Holbrooke's negotiating of the Dayton Accords, putting an end to the Bosnian War. I will then move forward in time, pretty quickly to 2022 and to the question of the origins of that war. Thirdly, I'll try to take some lessons from the war to the extent that we can establish them at this moment in time. And then again, out of homage to Holbrooke, we'll, by way of conclusion, focus on problem solving. What does problem solving look like when you're in the midst of a war where there really isn't much of an end in sight? And that's where I will end my remarks this evening before going into a conversation with Dan and then going into a conversation with all of you this evening. So upon coming here, I found on the shelf a book that I was aware of but had not read for quite a while, published in 1998, and it's titled To End a War. And this book is written by Richard Holbrooke, as we know, one of the founders of the American Academy. And where I would like to begin my lecture is with a quote from this book. So let's just remember the year of publication, 1998, so some 3 years after the Dayton Accords had been finalized, and Holbrooke had written a book to explain what happened and also to draw certain conclusions. So this is in the words of Richard Holbrooke circa 1998. Quote, "The Clinton administration was severely criticized in the early 1990s for reneging on our commitments to European security and for lowering the general priority accorded to foreign affairs. In short, for weak leadership in foreign policy. Dayton changed this almost overnight. Criticism of President Clinton as a weak leader ended abruptly, especially in Europe and among Muslim nations. Washington was now praised for its firm leadership, or even chided by some Europeans for too much leadership. But even those who chafed at the reassertion of American power conceded, at least implicitly, its necessity. As I suggested at the time, this was not a serious problem. It was better to be criticized for too much leadership than for too little. After Dayton, American foreign policy seemed more assertive, more muscular. This may have been as much perception as reality, but the perception mattered." Okay, that's Richard Holbrooke. And I suspect that the Biden administration, when the time comes to write books and memoirs, which will be, I suspect, relatively soon in some cases, would like a very similar framing for its activities in the war in Ukraine. In fact, I can kind of envision a paragraph like this from the memoirs of Jake Sullivan. And at issue would be sort of assertion or reassertion of American leadership. That's the phrase from Holbrooke, reassertion of American power. And that mirrors quite precisely the language of the Biden administration, or the Biden administration mirrors the language of Richard Holbrooke, when the Biden administration has said often, and perhaps most persuasively about its actions in Ukraine, that America is back. But obviously, we inhabit a very different world from the one that Holbrooke inhabited. And the difference is not that there was peace in Europe then and that there's war now. Holbrooke's is a book written about a war, and as with much of Richard Holbrooke's thinking and writing, it was written in the shadow of the Vietnam War, it was written in the shadow of the Second World War, and it was written in the shadow of the Second World War. And in fact, we know date of publication, 1998, the tensions were not yet resolved in former Yugoslavia, and war would hover over the Balkans throughout the 1990s. So it's not the difference between war and peace. The difference is here that Holbrooke could plausibly and credibly title his book To End a War, a rather forthright title, whereas the war in Ukraine, which began in February 2022, or more precisely in February 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, is nowhere near from ending. So this is not a book that anybody on the Russian side, on the Ukrainian side, on the European side, on the US side, is able to write at the present moment. Nor could the United States, for all of its various powers, nor is the United States in the position to wave a wand and to make this war end. The task of President Biden and the task of a President Harris or a President Trump will be not to end the war. Perhaps that will happen in the short to medium term. It's more likely to be to manage a war and to manage well what is destined, I think, to be a long war. But I'd like to still go back to Richard Holbrooke for just another moment and for just another quote, which to me is a snapshot of American foreign policy in 1998. Here's Holbrooke again. The three main pillars of American foreign policy in Europe are US-Russian relations, NATO enlargement, and Bosnia. Holbrooke, if you read the book, assessed US-Russian relations to be in quite good shape in 1998. Clearly to end a war was written before the NATO-Serbia conflict, which was one of the factors that soured relations between the United States and Russia. And at the same time, Holbrooke thought that NATO enlargement was generally accepted in Moscow, again, circa 1998. And here, it doesn't seem to me that Holbrooke is saying anything particularly strange or controversial. There had been quite a bit of institutional cooperation between NATO and Russia in 1995, 1996, 1997. And so what Holbrooke is writing, I think, in 1998 is something close to the conventional wisdom about the ease of NATO enlargement. And then finally, Holbrooke found the locus of difficulty for European security and for US policy in Europe in former Yugoslavia, which is to say in Bosnia, to be precise. I think one can say with emphasis and with clarity that none of this any longer obtains. US-Russian relations are probably the worst at the present moment that they have ever been. I don't like melodrama. I wouldn't want to indulge in it, but I think the Cold War was more structured, had more predictability, more regularity than what we have at the present moment. And I think that Russia and the United States have never been as close as they are now to a conventional war. So that's, of course, very far from the universe of Richard Holbrooke. NATO enlargement is not an especially active part of US foreign policy at the present moment, though it is true that two countries entered the alliance under Trump, despite some of what Trump had said about the alliance. And of course, Sweden and Finland entered the alliance under Biden. And it's also clear that NATO and Russia are vehemently on opposite sides now of a massive war. So this is, again, another profound difference. And the locus of difficulty for the United States is not Bosnia, and it's not even Yugoslavia. The locus of difficulty when it comes to European security for the United States is Ukraine. So we have entered very clearly a different world, and in some respects, we've left behind the world or the Europe that Richard Holbrooke so interestingly describes in his 1998 memoir. To analyze the origins of Russia's 2022 invasion, the origins of the war in Ukraine, is therefore to grasp, or to begin to grasp, how profoundly Europe has changed since the 1990s, and more importantly, it is to grasp, or to begin to grasp, why Europe has changed so profoundly. It is to assess our world, not Richard Holbrooke's world, and it is to beg the question, bearing in mind the three pillars that Holbrooke mentions of American foreign policy in the late 1990s, it is to beg the question of what the main pillars of American foreign policy in Europe should be today. I'm going to scrupulously not answer that question in the rest of this lecture, but it's open season, of course, when we have conversation and discussion to get into that dilemma. I'd like to turn now away from Holbrooke and away from the 1990s, and I would like to turn to what I believe to be the 4 points of origin for the war in Ukraine. This is a skeleton key or a précis of the book that Dan mentioned, Collisions, The Origins of the War in Ukraine and the New Global Instability. So this is the core of the argument, and satisfyingly for a historian at least, the whole story crystallizes around a single person, a single moment, and a single decision. And this is, of course, Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine on a massive scale on the 24th of February, 2022. So in a way, to answer that question of why it happened is, I think, to get to the heart of the matter. And in some ways, to get to the heart of the matter of what has changed in Russia, in the United States, in Europe over the course of the last 26 years. First, as a cause or an origin of the war is something very simple, basic, but I think fundamental, and can be characterized in its most neutral terms as a Russian desire to control or to have a high degree of influence over Ukraine. The people of Ukraine, the territory of Ukraine, you can figure it differently. It has, of course, deep historical roots in the history of the Soviet Union, and before that in the history of the Russian Empire. So this is not some recent phenomenon or recent development. This is an area of territory in which Russia has always had deep interests, and because of those deep interests, a strong desire for influence, and when influence doesn't work as such, a desire for control. I don't think that the inevitability of empire is the best explanation here. I think the inevitability or the inevitable desire for regional influence is a better way of characterizing this story. And without going too greatly into detail, although one could, of course, with this, I would just say that there is a trajectory of Russian attitude from the collapse of the Soviet Union, when you have for the first time an independent Russia, independent Ukraine. There's a trajectory of attitude that begins with relatively peaceful attempts to control Ukraine's destiny through conventional diplomacy, through people-to-people ties, through corruption, through coercion, through manipulation. You have all of that. That is sort of the first phase of this story. This changes quite consequentially in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, where it becomes much more of a military proposition. But even then, there was, I think, a preference on Moscow's part to use limited military means to resolve the problem or resolve the difficulties that Russia had with Ukraine. And of course, Putin's decision, which he had to have made before the 24th of February, 2022, is a quite significant change of calculus. It is agonizing for an academic and for a historian to have to operate with this question of when Putin decided and what his decision was with no evidence. We don't have a paper trail. We have no reliable evidence to work off of. So even what I've just presented to you, although it makes sense to me, is not much more than inference, but I think inference is the best that any of us can do. So one key factor, the most important explanatory factor, is this Russian desire for influence, and when influence doesn't work, for control. A second factor is a mirror of the first in some ways, or it helps to explain why the first is as prominent as it is at times, and this is Ukraine's vulnerability. And by this, I mean the vulnerability of an independent Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you look at the factors that constitute Ukrainian foreign policy or its position in the world after 1991, there are a lot of warning signs that don't point to war, but that help us to understand Ukraine's vulnerability. For one, Ukraine has no allies after 1991. It has trading partners, it has friends, it has countries that it works with, but it is a part of no alliance structure. So the three Baltic republics were, of course, parts of the Soviet Union up until 1991. They have a very different destiny, profoundly different destiny from Ukraine after 1991, because a bit more than a decade after the fall of the Soviet Union, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were able to join NATO, were able to join the European Union, and could become fully fledged members of the club. That's not the story with Ukraine, and of course, that's an acute kind of vulnerability, especially when you add on two other factors. One is geography, that Ukraine has enormous borders, and this is not a country that is ringed with mountains or with oceans. And even a very superficial review of Ukrainian history, or better yet, to read the books of Serhiy Plokhy, who was just mentioned as somebody who's spoken here, will help you to understand that in the 20th century and before, the history of invasion plays just a fearsomely prominent role in the history of Ukraine. And that is in part a function of Ukraine's geography. Also, before 2022, Ukraine had what could be described as a medium-sized military. Not no military, a military that was in fact expanding since 2014, but not one of the world's major militaries, and certainly on paper much, much smaller and less capable than the Russian military. And finally, you could say Ukraine lives in a rough neighborhood. I don't think that this is how we perceived Ukraine after 1991. We thought of Europe as, sort of expanding, benign, spreading its wings, and sort of bringing in more and more countries into the fold. But if we go back to the history before 1991, we see exactly how tough this neighborhood is. It's not the place where you would want to be vulnerable. And a final factor in Ukraine's vulnerability is Ukrainian politics itself after 1991. The point can be overdone and turned into propaganda, but Ukraine is, how would you describe it, a troubled polity after 1991. Regional tensions, oligarchization of a very high degree, money that often flowed into rent seeking and away from real economic growth, and a country that had a hard time getting its act together. And that too created certain vulnerabilities that fed into this overall story of war and invasion. But let's turn our attention now a bit away from Ukraine and more toward the heart and soul of the transatlantic relationship. And it's not a very cheering or cheerful story if you turn your attention in this direction. So here are my two final points of origin for the Russian invasion in February 2022. And the third is, this is just my judgment, I'm not speaking for Moscow in this case or for Putin, although I suspect that he would share this judgment, but that Europe and the United States demonstrated remarkably weak leadership when it came specifically to Ukraine, but probably more broadly to the region at large. And this is in the crucial years between 2014 and 2022. Again, I don't want to get bogged down in details here, but there's something called the Minsk diplomatic process. This was put in place between September of 2014 and February of 2015, and this was supposed to be the solution to the problem. And the problem was Russia's annexation of Crimea, although we can put that a bit to the side because what Minsk was really concerned with was Russia's incursion into eastern Ukraine or into the Donbass. And since I worked in government at this time, I feel like I can say with great confidence what it was that we were driving for. And what we were driving for was a removal of Russian troops from eastern Ukraine. And there were sanctions put in place to have this effect. And Minsk diplomacy was devised as a mechanism or a process or a tool to get the Russian soldiers out. I'm simplifying in a way, but I think it's a valid portrait. And this is the sort of second part of the story. So after setting these conditions that Russia must leave and attaching certain punitive measures to these conditions, what we witnessed between 2014 and 2022 is Russia not leaving. And not only does Russia not leave, but both Germany and the United States, in their own fashion and with their own timeline, start to normalize relations with Russia. Of course, for a German audience, I don't need to polemicize about Nord Stream 2. I think Germans have done a very good job of polemicizing about that themselves over the last 2.5 years. But of course, Nord Stream 2 is the iconic image of that. But I don't think Washington can pat itself on the back in this regard, because the first 6 months of the Biden administration, in which the Biden administration gave Germany the green light for Nord Stream 2, were clearly a moment when the United States was trying to normalize relations with Russia for reasons that at the time I think were quite understandable. The importance of the pandemic, the importance of China, the importance of moving on, the sense that was an illusion that things had died down or quieted down in eastern Ukraine. So in a way, no problem, no need for a solution. Let's just sweep it under the carpet and move on. This was, I think, I'll just put it in somewhat stark terms, a spectacular display of weakness, and one that would play, of course, into the decision to invade in 2022. This takes me to my fourth reason for the war, or fourth point of origin, and it's similar to the third, but it's a little bit more global in purview, and it concerns the United States more than it does Europe. And this is a view, I believe, in Moscow, that many things were lacking in American foreign policy from 2001 to 2022. I would put Afghanistan largely at the center of this story. And by this, I do not mean the pullout from Afghanistan in August of 2021, although that's happening in a year that's very consequential, the year before the invasion. But I think that's too often used for partisan purposes to sort of score points against the Biden administration, as we saw in, I think, both of the presidential debates so far, that point came up. It's not the pullout, I think, that really matters. It's the war that wasn't won. And the fact that the war terminates with the Taliban coming back to power. So, you sort of calculate the significance of that and look at it from a Russian point of view. And I think that it serves as a kind of encouragement to invade Ukraine, because you can, in some ways, plug in that narrative. But there are other things that could be put into the picture as well. I think the Iraq War is more ambiguous, and lots of other conflicts are more ambiguous. But Afghanistan plays a role in that regard. Political polarization, the perception of political polarization in the United States is not an organic cause of the war in Ukraine. It's far afield, but I think it implied a country that would have a hard time dealing with a major foreign policy crisis. And of course, January 6th, which happens, 13 months before the Russian invasion, January 6th would suggest to anyone, whether American, Russian, or otherwise, that this is a country with serious problems and may just be incapable of acting on the international stage. And then finally, you can kind of put all of this into a package in a way that with the United States, the period after the end of the Cold War, where the US has failed, it has often failed because it lacks patience and because it lacks follow through. And here you could, sort of tally up a long list of crises and a long list of wars. And of course, Putin is no great fan of the United States, has a kind of uncharitable view of the country to begin with. So you filter it through the light of that uncharitable view, and you can really, I think, build an argument for this sense of American weakness. So Russian intent to control, Ukrainian vulnerability, lack of concern for the region or lack of concern for Ukraine, as demonstrated by the failures of Minsk, and that's a collective transatlantic failure. And then finally, the perception of American incapacity or American weakness. And I think we have a portrait, in a way, of why not only Putin would have invaded at this time, but why he chose to do so in the second year of the Biden presidency. By which I don't mean that this is a story about Biden, but just at that moment in time. I'm going to skip over now the war itself, leave that completely to the side. And I'm going to turn now to, I think, 3 lessons that can be taken from this war and that can be adopted. And in my view, should be taken seriously by people working on planning and by people who are trying to come to some strategic understanding, not just of where we are now, but of where we need to go in the next couple of years. The first lesson is that Russia is tenacious in pursuit of its objectives in Ukraine. I think it would be difficult to argue against this point, but it's a point that has to be made. We got, especially in the first year, in our internet age, lots of memes and images of Russian tractors being pulled by Ukrainian farmers through the territory of Ukraine. And those are real images, I'm sure. Most of them are real. And they tell you something about the inefficiency of the Russian military. And that has been displayed time and again, that this is a military that is profligate with the lives of its soldiers. This is a military that often doesn't meet the mark and doesn't do what Moscow asks it to do. On the other hand, and you can sort of tally up all of these inefficiencies, it is equally or perhaps more important for the long-term trajectory of the war that Russia has been able to establish a network of global relationships that at the very least fund the war, and that in some ways provide sort of nodes or islands of support for Russia in the war. I think here of China, but there are many countries around the world that are willing to justify at least elements of the war, or sort of agree with the proposition that all countries or many countries fight wars of this kind, and that there's nothing particularly remarkable about it. So, with some degree, or perhaps a considerable degree of skill, this network has been established, has been created, and it means that Western technologies, and it's regularly found in missiles that are falling on Kiev and other cities, that there are American components in them. These are coming into Russia through smuggling routes. That's sort of one aspect of this story, but then there are countries like North Korea and Iran that are overtly supporting the Russian war effort. China is in some ambiguous middle ground in this regard, and the technology, the material, and the money is flowing into Russia in such a way that not only is Russia able to keep on fighting this war, but it is expanding its military capacity as we speak. And finally, although this point is one that has to be, sort of assessed, Putin has the domestic political support for the war that he needs, whether this is out of anti-war sentiment, whether this is out of fear for the repressiveness of the regime, whether this is out of full-throated patriotic support for the war. This is a very hard question to ascertain, but up until now, it works. It may not work forever, but it works for now, and that has allowed Russia to be extremely tenacious in the practice of this war. So that is lesson number 1, the tenacity. Lesson number 2, having indicted various American administrations and Germany and other countries for their weakness, let me flip the point around. Question number 2 is that Western leadership, and especially U.S. leadership, has made a difference in this war. It has not been insignificant or trivial or unimportant. And I'm reminded here of the quote that I read to you, or the piece of the quote that I read to you from Richard Holbrooke. Better to be criticized for too much leadership than for too little. Ukraine's successes on the battlefield, which are considerable, are of course the successes of Ukraine's soldiers, of Ukraine's policymakers, of Ukraine's civilians. And I think we all know the role that President Zelensky has played in this war. But it is important to emphasize that the United States and Europe have done a lot to enable these successes, and the recipe is not esoteric or difficult to outline. It's intelligence, targeting, technology sharing happening on a very massive level. It's military aid, I sometimes become frustrated with journalists for writing about all of the aid that's not being delivered and not writing perhaps as much as they should about the aid that is being delivered, which is a big story and has played a huge role on the battlefield. And of course, financial backing to the society and government of Ukraine is also crucially important. I think it is fair to say that if Europe and the United States had chosen not to support Ukraine, which is a choice they could have made, that Ukraine would probably have lost the war already. So it's that important, this degree of support, and has mattered, with really startling significance. Finally, third lesson, which kind of conflicts a little bit with lesson number 2. They don't perfectly align, these 3 lessons. This is the lesson that Ukraine does not have enough support to win the war on its terms, and its terms are terms that Zelensky has outlined again and again and again. Nothing unclear about Ukraine's war aims. This is the restoration of Ukraine's full sovereignty, Ukraine's entry into the European club, and Ukrainian life that can go on without the threat of further war or further invasion from Russia. That's what Ukraine is aiming at. I can't imagine any Ukrainian who wouldn't want to have that aim at the present moment, and there's nothing, in a way, controversial about what Zelensky is pushing for. It's crystal clear why he would be doing that and why he would wish to find that outcome. But I think I can say with some confidence that neither Friedrich Merz nor Kamala Harris, should either of them or both of them be elected, neither of them are going to change the calculus of too little support to achieve the aims that Zelensky wishes to achieve. The study of strategy is the study of available means in relation to achievable ends. And here, I think the portrait that we see before us at the present moment is extremely sobering. It is crucial for us to think through at the present moment, candidly, honestly, and with intellectual judiciousness and without wishful thinking. It is crucial to think through the available means and what kind of ends they are going to enable. We have to also, when we factor in to this equation what Russian tenacity means, we also have to think very hard about the relationship of means to ends, and we have to plan accordingly. There is at the moment quite a considerable gap between Western rhetoric in terms of what can be achieved and the reality of Western support. In my assessment, although these numbers do fluctuate, I think both in Germany and the United States, support for Ukraine has plateaued. And you can see many scenarios. We'll see what happens on Sunday's election. Not that it's going to change the overall portrait of German support for Ukraine, but you can see many scenarios where current levels of support for Ukraine may not be sustained in the future, and we need to think through what that means strategically. Ukraine does not have enough to get where it wishes to go, and so if we can't raise the level of support, and that politically is a very difficult task, where does that leave us strategically? And I think that's something we have to figure out. So I'll mention that only as a lesson, and will not attempt to solve that problem for you this evening, but we'll leave it at that. Finally, so as not to conclude in the spirit of gloominess and futility, I want to focus on problem solving and on 3 aspects of problem solving that we could consider also when factoring in what needs to be planned for, what the strategy needs to be, and what the approach needs to be to this war. From the German vantage point, from the US vantage point, and from the transatlantic vantage point. I think that these 3 problem-solving elements are pretty similar across the board, for Europe and for the United States. The first problem-solving, I guess it's advice I would have, or point I would make, is that we need to understand the proper function of diplomacy in this conflict. And I think here there's a lot of confusion in the public sphere, and there's a lot of opportunity in Germany and the US for demagoguery about quick fixes, quick ends, the achievement of peace. Let's just move through the suffering of this war and let's get beyond it. I think diplomacy is highly relevant to this conflict. How could it not be? But the diplomacy that is relevant to this conflict is day-to-day diplomacy, the day-to-day diplomacy of alliance maintenance. And that's arduous and difficult. Even among the best of friends and allies, it's difficult to keep big projects like support for Ukraine going. And that's going to be a huge challenge going forward. And that's a lot already to ask of diplomats, but that's where they should be spending most of their time and effort. It is not. The role of diplomacy, I would say, is not grand diplomacy in the Holbrooke manner, the kind of diplomacy that he orchestrated in Dayton, Ohio. I wish it were that, but that's not where we are at the present moment. And it's not the kind of grand diplomacy that you see at the end of the First World War, Versailles. And maybe this is a good thing, but it's not the kind of diplomacy that you see at the end of the Second World War. This would be Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, the various conferences where the kind of post-Second World War was mapped out and sketched out. A negotiated settlement to the war is highly unlikely under current conditions, and I would even say not worth pursuing because it is so unlikely. I don't see signs that Russia is ready for a kind of peace that we could accept, and one that would bring long-term prosperity and peace to Ukraine. Until those stars align, I think it's better to hold off. Of course, conditions can change, and when conditions change, you can change your arguments, but current conditions to me provide no grounds or no room for big, sort of conflict-ending diplomacy. This does not mean that diplomacy is irrelevant. Again, I mentioned alliance maintenance, but there is a kind of diplomacy I think that we need to pioneer in this conflict. You could call it 21st century diplomacy, and some of it is going to be quite difficult, but it is going to be the enlistment of countries across the globe in figuring out what the end phase of the war is going to be. And I have in mind here especially China, which does not see eye to eye with Germany and does not see eye to eye with the United States on the war, but you can go backwards in your reasoning. China is going to be very important to the end phase of the war because of China's relationship to Russia and because China is just such a big player in the war. And also, a topic I think that is far too little discussed, China is going to be a key actor in Ukraine's reconstruction. It's not just going to be Europe and the US that are going to reconstruct Ukraine. It's also going to be China. So I think there needs to be a new kind of imaginative diplomacy that can figure out a role for China that is, constructive, that can be achieved perhaps through persuasion. And I don't think we're there yet, but it's a direction in which we could move. So that's one way in which problem solving could be addressed perhaps on the diplomatic front. Secondly, and this is maybe more a matter of attitude than really of pure policy, but to me very, very important. And I think I would make this point about diplomats, but I would make it also about journalism and media coverage of the war. I think we need to prioritize, this is lesson number 2, we need to prioritize immediate challenges over abstract challenges when it comes to Ukraine. Problem solving in Ukraine should not center on the theoretical question of where Ukraine fits in Europe. This is the kind of thing that can be discussed endlessly. It's endlessly fascinating to me. Where any country fits in Europe, what is Europe? What is this protean thing that we call Europe? It's we fellows could talk about this at breakfast for hours and hours and hours and would profit from that, but that's not where policymakers should be aiming most of their attention and putting most of their effort. It is sufficient for now to say that Ukraine fits in Europe. That's where it is. Ukraine is Europe. I think it's legitimate, it's right, it's proper to say that. And then we can improvise in terms of what the configurations are going to be in terms of Ukraine's relationship to NATO and Ukraine's relationship to the European Union. But in a way, these are questions for philosophers. Ukraine has to survive the winter, and it has to survive the winter under very difficult conditions. And to survive the winter, it's going to need a huge amount of practical support. In the war, Ukraine is going to need drones. It's going to need ammunition. It's going to need air defenses. And it's going to need the means to keep the electrical grid up and running for its society, but also for the war effort. These, to me, are all highly practical problems. And if I were Secretary of State and could bring Richard Holbrooke back to life, I would send him not to negotiate with Russia, but to work on drone production and ammunition production and generator production and all of the things that Ukraine is going to need just to keep itself afloat and to keep itself going. And so I think that 2 months of coverage of the NATO summit in Washington this summer was great. It's standard journalistic procedure, but it was all kind of beside the point. We should be focusing with laser-like focus on the practicalities of supporting Ukraine and the practicalities of what Ukraine needs. And my third and final meditation on problem solving takes our subject this evening back to the figure of Richard Holbrooke once again. And this is a point that I would put as follows, that we need to understand in this conflict the preeminent value of patience and self-confidence. Now, the journalist George Packer, who I know has darkened the doors of the American Academy on a couple of occasions, the journalist George Packer has written an elegant and also very elegiac book about Richard Holbrooke titled Our Man. And in his title, in the subtitle to his book, rather, Packer links Holbrook's career to, quote unquote, the end of the American century. And while writing this book, I'm imagining, but with some confidence, Packer searched for big metaphors. He published the book in 2019, and I think the book is perhaps even more a book about Trump's America than it may be about Richard Holbrook's America. And he came up with the metaphors and the themes of decline and loss, the great national unraveling, which is a word that he used in the title of another of his books, George Packer, about the United States. And in his narrative, Packer tends to concentrate on all that Holbrook did not achieve, from becoming Secretary of State, which he didn't achieve, to bringing peace to Afghanistan and resolving the war in some effective way, which Holbrook also didn't achieve in his later years. But this, I think, is to derive too little from Holbrook's biography. And I think in some ways it's also to misread Holbrook's biography. What big Washington career or big Berlin career doesn't have a lot of disappointments? That's par for the course. Holbrook's biography and his example, I would say, are still useful. And in the end, they say, his biography and his example say more about effort and purpose than about decline and loss. Let me go back to some words that I've already quoted. This, Holbrook wrote about admiration for American foreign policy after Dayton, quote, may have been as much perception as reality, but the perception mattered. Impatient as he often was, Holbrook's greatest asset as a diplomat was his forward-looking self-confidence. And from it, we can distill a key aspect of Western problem solving in Ukraine, which is that in addition to the practicalities of supporting Ukraine, and these are a matter of money and materiel, the West must recognize, or it must remember, that perception matters. And remembering that perception matters, the West must project, and doing this as much as our messy democracies allow, the perception of patience and self-confidence. Patience, because the scale of the problem is so enormous, and because, as I've already tried to argue, Russia is so tenacious about realizing its aims for the war. And self-confidence, because to solve problems, you have to believe that you can solve problems, as Holbrook himself did in Dayton, Ohio, in 1995. This is true if you wish to end a war, and it's equally true if you wish to manage a long and difficult war successfully. So thank you so much this evening for your attention.
Well, Michael, congratulations on a terrifically interesting, cogent, well-organized, and I emphasize well-organized presentation. So I'll ask a few questions and then I'll throw you to the lions. My first question is about your first cause, Russian desire to have a high degree of influence and control over Ukraine. I'd like to ask you to go a little deeper there. If I were telling the story with my limited expertise, I would say that Russia saw Ukraine slipping into the West, developing deeper and deeper ties with the EU, and a strong aspiration to join NATO. George W. Bush had said Ukraine will be in NATO. And that to have a democratizing large country on Russia's border was largely inconceivable and anathema even to Putin, and that years of meddling in Ukrainian affairs with all the corruption that you alluded to, and the lever of the natural gas connection that was so important to the Ukrainian economy. He saw himself with all kinds of tools to do things, and the whole idea of a cordon sanitaire going up in smoke. In Putin's presentation, it's all about profound cultural ties. Russia comes from Kyiv, after all, originally in the 9th century, and it was inconceivable that they should be separated. And I'm wondering if you want to dig down more and tell us why you think that. What does that mean? The need for control and influence and control.
Sure. No, I think I agree with much of what you say. Well, I think outline just for the sake of fleshing out the story, maybe you're characterizing one would be on the word democratizing and the role of democracy in the conflict, or just the kind of polity that Ukraine is. But first, what's striking to me, and in a way extremely sad about this narrative, is that I think it's more random, perhaps, than you suggest, or perhaps it's more random than I myself suggested by implying that there's some kind of permanent desire for Russian control. I think that that's there, but it plays itself out in such haphazard ways. So I want to say a little bit about the haphazardness of these origins, and then in my second point, develop what I think is really crucial to understanding Russia's decision to invade, which is the Russian contempt for Ukraine. So yes, the fear that Ukraine is going to join the West, but also Russia's contempt for what Ukraine was, or in particular for what Ukraine was under Zelensky. So, in the book, I make much of the strange coincidence that the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and the flight of Viktor Yanukovych, both happen, sort of happen 100 years apart from each other. 1914 in one case, and 2014, and this is just an odd coincidence. But I do think the flight of Viktor Yanukovych, and I'll just say a bit more about that in a moment for those who might not know all the details of it, is the random event that sets a lot of stuff in motion. And Viktor Yanukovych was, the Eastern-oriented, thuggish president of Ukraine from 2010 to 2014. And in a way, Viktor Yanukovych gave Russia everything Russia was looking for, a kind of deference, lack of interest in joining NATO. He's definitely not a politician who was easy to work with for the West. And a revolution forms because of something that he doesn't do. He doesn't sign an association agreement with the European Union, and he's chased from office. He flees for fear of his own life. Nobody quite expected him to do it at that moment. And I think this enormous vacuum opens up in the situation, and Russia quite quickly moves to annex Crimea, and everything moves in a much more military direction. But I'm not sure without that random event, without that random occurrence, that we have the war in Ukraine. So there are these big structural shifts and trajectories, and I think that you mentioned most of the important ones. Ukraine's move to the West, a sort of Russian fear about that. But within that is a circumstance, a kind of an unexpected event that is there really at the center of the narrative. So nothing was really all that predetermined, certainly with 2014, and perhaps nothing was predetermined with 2022. If you look back at the larger picture, the randomness of it is striking. In terms of the Russian view of the Ukrainian polity, and can leave aside, unless people in the audience are interested, questions of religion and civilization, and the argument that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, which Putin made in the summer of 2021 before the invasion. I think that what we sometimes don't get quite right on our side of the conflict, we think of all the good things that were happening in Ukraine after 2014, that the country was democratizing, it was Europeanizing, it was Westernizing, it was moving forward. But I think that Putin had a very traditional Russian leader's view of Ukraine as a country that's just a basket case. This country is just a mess. It can't get its act together. What does it do in 2019 when it gets the chance to vote? It elects a comedian. It's a military joke. And I think only that, I think the point is significant for one reason. Only that could explain the manner of invasion in 2022, because the Russians really expected Ukraine to fall like a house of cards. So Putin often speaks about the big bad Ukraine and the big bad NATO, terrifying Russia and challenging Russia's interests. In some ways, Russian actions on the eve of the invasion suggest almost the opposite. It's like a fruit that could be picked because it wasn't a real nation, it wasn't a real polity, it wasn't a real state. So this mixture of fear and contempt is, I think, essential. And I think too often we miss the contempt.
2014 to 2022 is a really interesting period, and you called out the U.S. for mistakes and weak leadership in that period. I was in and out of Ukraine from 1994 till 2008. And I have to say, I had a fairly Russian view of Ukraine during that period because the corruption was overwhelming. And in fact, and you may get asked this, even today, many Europeans are concerned about putting so many chips on Ukraine because of the high level of corruption and the expectation that corruption will dog any reconstruction effort. But it was a country that could not get its act together, and I'm wondering to what extent you think there was a failure beginning in 2014 on the part of the U.S. in particular, or the West more generally, to recognize the creation of a real national sentiment, a desire to build a real country on the one hand, and on the other hand, that at least in Obama 2, before the well, in Obama too, there was always this feeling like we had to make deals with the Russians on other things like Syria, and therefore we weren't going to complain too much about Crimea. So it was a kind of combination, a confluence of two really bad trends: an inability to see what was going on, and a refusal to reconsider the trade-offs we were looking at. We very much wanted Putin to help us wind down the civil war in Syria, and so we were kind of looking for hope in all the wrong places.
Yes, I think that's all very accurate. The U.S. intelligence service has expected Ukraine to lose the war, I think, in 3 weeks. I know that the German assessment was probably pretty similar, and
Germans didn't expect it to happen.
didn't expect it to happen. So I guess it's hard to assess how long it would go for. It's easy in retrospect to be very critical of these judgments. It's not so much the wrongness of the judgments that matters. It's more, as you're suggesting, Dan, what it says about views of Ukraine. And two things I think I can say in response: that a lot was certainly missed after 2014, and the strengths of Ukrainian democracy, I think, were probably missed. I think their democracy is very important, not so much in the Russian perception of Ukraine, but in Ukrainian life in general. And here, having criticized my old office in a way for not being tough on Minsk, I think one of the things that the State Department and the US government did well in those years, the Obama years, was to focus on certain aspects of reform. And then in 2019, you get a democratic election in Ukraine, and that yields the figure of Zelensky. And without Zelensky, I don't think Ukraine would be where it is. So every effort that was made, and often it seemed very mundane at the time about sort of voting rights and electoral procedures in Ukraine, was really an effort, an effort to the good, and that was significant. I think something that was missed was also Ukraine's military modernization after 2014. That was the work of Petro Poroshenko, who really did prioritize military modernization, and of course that paid dividends. And the strengths of Ukrainian civil society, I think, were acknowledged. Those, I think, were felt. I mean, certainly we spoke about them a lot, but that this would create the degree of resilience that you've seen in Ukraine, I think, has come as a surprise. And I wouldn't want to go too far down this path, but in the U.S. in the Trump years, everything gets overtaken by sort of first impeachment.
By just Trump.
The
phenomenon that it's Trump.
Relationship between Trump and Zelensky, the way in which this all became subordinated in a sense to American domestic politics, or that was what Trump was trying to do. And so I think that muddied the waters so extraordinarily that it was difficult to recover from that. And so maybe the storyline of Ukraine's evolution got missed in part because when we looked at Ukraine in the U.S. in those years, fans and critics of Trump alike, what we really saw was ourselves, and that was surely costly. The second point that I would make is that the U.S. could never figure out where Ukraine fit and how important it was. And President Obama gave a very surprising interview on a number of fronts to Jeffrey Goldberg of the Atlantic when he was leaving the White House, and he said, "Well, I'm not sure it's really in our national interest to support Ukraine." And I remember when we were in government, we read that as, "Oh, that's a surprise to us." We didn't realize that it was only questionably in the national interest to support Ukraine. But I think that this is true really from Trump to Merkel to Obama to Biden, is they just couldn't figure out how important Ukraine was. And it's a very punishing question in retrospect, although I could give you all of the real-time answers as to why it didn't take place. But why did the West refuse to modernize Ukraine's military much more rapidly after 2014? What was the inhibition? The fear, of course, was provoking Russia in a certain way, but there were other actions that the West did that were provocative to Russia, and those were somehow acceptable. And yet the real military modernization of Ukraine occurred largely on Ukraine's own devices after 2014. But why? Why didn't we think of it as sort of more important? Why didn't we figure it more highly? And that, of course, in retrospect, is a very painful circumstance. If all the military spending that has been done for Ukraine since the start of the war had been done 5 years or 10 years before the war, perhaps it would have had enough deterrent effect to make the war impossible for Russia to conduct. So it's easy to do those kinds of hypotheticals, counterfactuals, and go back in time, but I think it just speaks to how hard it was to prioritize, and it ended up not being a very good job of prioritization.
Yeah. Last question, and then I'll turn it over to all the people with better questions. You counsel strategic patience, and I think that's right, but you don't give us the comfort of what the payoff from strategic patience will be eventually. So is the idea that one day something snaps in Russia, or that Ukraine develops so much self-sufficiency with its wartime economy that this just goes on for as far as the eye can see? Strategic patience is, forgive me, but as someone who also worked in the State Department, it's something we all believe in, and it is such a non-sale with the American people as well as the German people and lots of other people. It's it's a showstopper. And so what's your pitch to the electorate? Why they should engage in strategic patience at the cost of 60-70 billion a year?
Can I bypass your question a little bit and not make a pitch to the electorate?
No.
Okay. Let me give you the real technocrat's pitch, and then I'll pitch it to the electorate. The technocrat's pitch would go as follows: is I think the best that we can do in terms of developing an optimistic vision of where we can take the war. We can't defeat Russia. It's a huge country. It's a nuclear power. It's got a massive military. And nobody is going to sanction the policies that would be necessary to go head-to-head with Russia. That's not even in the conversation. And as I said in the presentation, Ukraine doesn't have the means available to it to win on its terms. And everybody I speak to who comes back from Ukraine conveys that message with more and more concern, also about Ukraine's ability to kind of hold together and morale and all of that. So it is necessary to have a vision, and I think that this is the best that I can do. That we can move the war to a phase, not end the war, but move the war to a phase where it is possible for Ukraine and Russia to work out certain rules of engagement. What does this look like? That Ukraine, of course, is there in Kursk province of Russia, several hundred square kilometers of territory. Just 2 days ago, Ukraine made a spectacular hit on an ammunition depot in Russia, and Russia is wreaking all kinds of havoc in Ukraine. So they both have vast tools of destruction, and it could be in the interest of both countries to minimize, to figure out what to do and what not to do over time, so that the war becomes not, it's not eliminated, but it becomes more predictable, in a sense, less destructive. And there are wars that can serve as a template for this. Perhaps even the Cold War would be one model, that it begins in anarchy, and then you see in the Cold War that rules develop, and it becomes a much more manageable affair. And with that, a degree of normalcy returns to Ukraine, and Ukraine's European path becomes, at the very least, easier. That, to me, is the kind of best case scenario I can come up with. If I'm going to speak to the electorate, I'll go back to the Cold War past and do what Paul Nitze did with the Cold War. Sort of a key strategic planner, and he just scared the heck out of people to get people to support the Cold War. It's not my favorite tactic, but you asked me to speak to the electorate, so I guess I'll make you my surrogate electorate. What would be the situation in which we fail in Ukraine? What does that look like? And what would be the knock-on effect of that? And I think it's easy to outline a whole series of extremely negative repercussions, whether it's a migrant crisis on a huge scale, whether it's the war sort of not drying up, but moving westward and becoming a war of Ukraine's periphery, which is to say with with Poland and other states that are NATO members, with an emboldened Russia that I don't think would be marching onto European territory, but would be trying to use fear to divide and conquer in Europe, trying to drive wedges in the transatlantic relationship and wedges into the European Union. All of that, borders on a nightmare scenario and becomes, for our respected electorate, a reason for supporting strategic patience. But the technocrats' view is the one where I think we could go. But fear of failure is legitimate in this case, because it is true that the stakes are exceptionally high. So, for the politicians, I suppose it would be, we could think of how this would look for a Harris administration that's going to have to make a new case to the population about the war, perhaps a bit of fear and a bit of vision, and also a bit of a sense of how far we've come with the war. I know it's a very difficult case to make at the present moment when things look so bad and there's so much suffering in Ukraine, but Ukraine still controls 82% of its territory. It's sovereign, it's independent, and that's an achievement. So that too could be worked into the narrative for our electorate.
So let's go frozen conflict is kind of the motto then.
I think so. That makes sense, yeah.
All right.
Viva the frozen conflict.
Questions? We start right here. Wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you very much. Manfred Nitsch, I'm here, professor at the Free University. My question is to you as a historian. How important is the sovereignty of Ukraine in historical terms? Does it belong to the vulnerabilities that there are weak points during the war, for instance, or strong points, perhaps as a member of the United Nations, formerly independent member of the United Nations, and what to think about the history of sovereign Ukraine as a nation? It looks to me as if it were a vulnerability more one on your list.
That's a great question. I think I would have been more receptive to the notion of the vulnerability of Ukrainian statehood before the 2022 war, and it goes back to what Dan was saying a moment ago. I mean, Ukrainians have been so tenacious in defense of their sovereignty and independence that there has to be a lot to it. In a sense, I think they've really earned that in the course of the war, and they've demonstrated they are willing to suffer enormously for the sake of being sovereign and independent and not compromising. Now, Ukrainian history is a very complicated matter, and it is, of course, true that there's not a history of independent Ukrainian statehood really until 1991, with the brief exception of what happens after the Bolshevik Revolution. And you have the very, I think from a contemporary vantage point, heartrending story of Poland making it to Paris during the Versailles negotiations and getting a nation state. They got it. Lithuania got it. A few other Eastern and Central European nations got a nation state, but Ukraine did not. And so Western Ukraine became a part of interwar Poland, and Eastern Ukraine became a part of the Soviet Union. So that did, I suppose, build in certain vulnerabilities. What is this as a nation state? How viable is it? But to me, these are not vexing questions at the moment. I really think that point has been proven on the battlefield. And in a different sense, I mean, certainly for U.S. foreign policy, this is a paramount point. Ukraine matters in two respects. It matters as such, in humanitarian terms and in geopolitical terms for what will happen to Ukraine, but it also matters as a precedent. And the clearest, again, go back to our electorate question, to make clear the stakes to an electorate, that if the precedent is set that nations can be carved up, we'll probably go back to the very worst of European history in that regard. And it's not every European leader is a Boy Scout in this respect. I think Viktor Orban has territorial ambitions that he flirts with. Maybe they're not serious, but they materialize. We're living at a moment of a right-wing resurgence in Europe where national borders could easily be put into question by any number of nations, and Russia would be delighted, would be thrilled to set that precedent at the present moment. Let's make Europe a huge military free-for-all and have the borders be designed by military force. I think in that kind of Europe, Russia would have a lot of cards to play. So there too, I think the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine matters in its own terms, but it matters really for Europe, and we could make the case globally, but I think Europe is probably sufficient to make the case for how high the stakes are.
Okay. How about you right here? Wait for the microphone, please. And you in the back. Let's see some hands back there. Okay, great.
I was disappointed that you didn't talk about the Orange Revolution and the
Sure.
desire for the Ukrainian people for democracy and freedom leading up to 2014. That's
Sure.
the reason why Russia took Crimea, because Putin was afraid of of the democracy movement in the Ukraine. And that's one question. Then the other thing, I think we have to go back to many centuries of Ukrainian history to understand why Ukraine feels closer to Europe and Poland,
Sure.
Lithuania, and certainly not never Russia. And if you would say a few words on that.
Sure. I think I'll politely disagree with you about the Orange Revolution. And again, we really suffer for lack of evidence in this regard in terms of how Russia looks at the world or how they look at the region. I'm just going to guess here, but I will stand by this guess. I don't think when Putin looks at Ukraine, he sees a democracy. I think he sees a flimsy state run by oligarchs who are in many cases manipulable, and that it's a puppet of the West. And what you need to do is to smash that relationship with the West in a way to break the puppethood and just bring it back into the fold. But you're not smashing anything that's really of value or anything that is even real. It's just smashing the...
In his view.
Correct, yeah, so smashing the artifice. I don't think that the Orange Revolution provoked Russia because it was about democracy. I mean, his guy lost, so that angered him, but I think he's never taken Ukraine seriously as a democracy. I don't think he looks at the United States as a democracy. A few rich people run it. There are these powerful figures. You have to deal with who's in charge. That's how the world works. That's how Russia works. Democracy is an abstraction that's, for the naive and for the foolish. I think he does have a kind of dark view of the world that's divided up into power in ways that disadvantage Ukraine, but don't really disadvantage Ukraine as a democracy. And certainly, we could spend many hours talking about Ukrainian history. I don't know if I'd be quite as categorical as you were in your question. I mean, there's a huge overlap between Ukraine and Russia in many ways historically, not always a happy overlap to be sure. But there is a distinctive historical development, and Serhiy Plokhy has traced it as well as anybody I know, from the medieval times to early modern times, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Hetmanate, the rise of a national idea in Ukraine in the 19th century after the revolutions of 1848, and then, of course, religious questions, cultural questions, linguistic questions that can orient Ukraine much more to Europe and to the West than toward Russia. I mean, I think that this is a question with a degree of fluidity probably until 2022. But after 2022, I don't think that there's all that much fluidity left.
I think that's a very important point because in our modern world, we're ahistorical. We don't know
be sure.
these facts. We don't understand.
To be sure.
And I've lived in Germany for 50 years, and I'm appalled at how in the German society there's no interest for history, for anything east of Germany. And this is a lack of our
Okay, I think that is a longer discussion.
But we need more historians for sure.
The hand that's way up in the back.
Hi. We always talk about Russia and Putin as if they were one and the same. Mm-hmm. And all this sort of fluid what-if discussion seems to involve Ukraine, the US, Europe, but never Russia, as if Putin is this perennial, eternal pharaoh that shall not be questioned. But is a man is in his mid-70s. Russia is not a rock economic solid country. Is there a scenario that is ever discussed of what happens if Putin is no longer at the helm, and what consequence would that have for possible development of the Ukrainian conflict? Would things go forth as if they go now or not?
Great, thanks for the question. Of course, there are lots of scenarios. There are always lots of scenarios. And they run the gamut from the optimist scenarios, which are not the easiest to argue for, but they exist and they should exist, which would be of some changing of the guard in Russia, where the costs of the war in Ukraine would be, let's say, accurately assessed, and the costs of the rupture with Europe would be accurately assessed, and that Russia would moderate and perhaps even go so far as to withdraw its troops from Ukraine and contemplate reparations and war crimes tribunals and the like. There's that scenario. Not science fiction, but not extraordinarily probable. There's two other scenarios that we could contemplate for the sake of trying to sketch out the future. And one is that Russia could enter, as it has occasionally in its history, into a period of turbulence, time of troubles in early modern history, the Civil War from 1917 to 1921, and really the 1990s could be looked upon as another time of turbulence and troubles, and that's very possible. Of course, we saw a military mutiny in Russia just the summer before last. It didn't succeed, but was certainly a very striking episode, and that's always possible. Countries that enter into big wars often invite that kind of outcome, right? The First World War collapses almost all of the empires that fought it, and that's something that you could certainly spin from the war in Ukraine, that there would be a military mutiny, an uprising, Putin's death, some kind of skirmish within the Kremlin itself, kind of Shakespearean fight for power that would just result in Russia's incapacity as a state. And if Russia is incapable as a state, it's not going to be able to wage the war. But I do think, and pardon my sort of intellectual conservatism here, the status quo is the safest argument. Maybe it's always the safest argument, but that it is a regime now that is so entrenched, the Putin regime, after 24 years, that it probably does have the potential to replicate itself. And whether that's through the appointment of an heir or some procedure that happens behind closed doors that results a little bit like the transition from Stalin to Khrushchev to Brezhnev, that you can sort of manage those transitions and still keep the system up and running. And if that's possible, as I do believe it is, and is the scenario that I would bet on, it would mean that the war would just be ongoing for as long as that regime is in place. A little bit grim to contemplate, but probably where we should keep our thinking.
Okay. You have one more question. I'm going to exercise favoritism and call on Matthias. You need the microphone.
Thanks. You talked about when you talked about the reasons for Russia invading Ukraine, I think you focused a lot on Ukraine itself, on its geographical position, on the weakness of the Ukrainian political situation, at least in the perception of Putin. Might have there been also a second focus of Putin, not directly aiming at Ukraine, but aiming at Europe itself through Ukraine? Giving another reason for splitting up, a reason for dispute, for divide, because obviously this would have been something bringing the Poles and Baltic state into a very problematic situation, and maybe having the southern and western parts of Europe not being of that kind of feeling of threat, because there is this underlying strategic goal of Russia to weaken Europe, because who has got hold on Europe will be the one who is in a perceived competition of superpowers, will be the one with the biggest stick. So as long as Europe is with America, it will be America. If you somehow manage to weaken or to bring Europe out of the game, then there might be a chance for Russia again, which then again would give some reasons, not just on Ukraine, but a longer strategic view, maybe an occasion in 22, but another step in a longer strategic approach.
Great. So this is the last question, so this is a good one to conclude on. And just in the spirit of the evening, let's go back once again to Holbrooke and to Dayton and to former Yugoslavia, because it is where a lot of things begin. And as much as we can talk about Putin the thug and Putin the civilizationalist and Putin who wants to sort of bring back the empire, this is somewhat more, I think, analytically, maybe persuasive, precise way of looking at his take on things that has a lot to do about who gets to write the rules in Europe. And so I just want to articulate why it was that I think Putin was frustrated in a big way, going back to Yugoslavia, touching briefly on the Iraq War, and then conclude with a sense of where he might be at the present moment in terms of his ambitions, not for Ukraine, but as you ask about his ambitions for Europe. What is it that Putin, or rather, sort of Yeltsin, Putin, Russian national security elite, what is it that they don't like about what happens in Yugoslavia, and they really don't like what happens in former Yugoslavia? Is especially, it's about 1998, it's not about 1995 in Dayton. They don't like that the US was beginning to write the rules, sort of at will. And so NATO goes out of territory in a bombing campaign in Serbia, NATO a defensive military alliance, is choosing a military engagement, sort of justifying it on its terms and kind of doing what it wants. And I think in the American calculus, it worked out well because it did bring stability to the region. It put an end to a humanitarian crisis, but it was read very differently in Moscow as if we are losing the right, in addition to the end of the Cold War, we're really losing the right to write the rules of how things work with European security. The Iraq War is significant, even though it's outside of Europe, because what it devalues is Russia's place on the UN Security Council. So the kind of global check or the global veto, such as it was, that the Soviet Union had once had and that Russia seemed to have in the 1990s was not valid or helpful with the Iraq War, which is really something that sours Putin on the United States. Much as he is a kind of anti-American, the Iraq War is a genuine turning point. And again, it's about who has the ability to write the rules. So I do think, again, in the spirit of your question, that Putin is extremely resentful, also in 2014, 2015, that Russia is not even able to write the rules in Ukraine. Forget about the Netherlands and, Portugal and Ireland, but it's not even able to write the rules in Ukraine. Russia does write the rules in Belarus, and it writes the rules in a few other places, arguably in the South Caucasus, at least up to a point, but not to its satisfaction in Ukraine in 2014, 2015. And I do think Putin had something of an expectation. Maybe Trump would finally listen to the argument, okay, you guys take Ukraine, we'll divide up the world in some ways. You be Stalin, I'll be Churchill, and we'll sort of write our percentages on the map and everything will turn out well. And that didn't come to pass with Trump and wouldn't come to pass with Biden. And Europeans also were not going to grant Putin the right to write the rules in Ukraine and elsewhere. And so he had come to an impasse. And to understand this, I think you have to understand the extreme war optimism that was there at the beginning of the war. It would be a quick war. It would be over in 2 weeks. There wouldn't be all these casualties. Ukraine would be demonstrated that Ukraine is not this shining democracy on the hill, but it's just this artifice that can be swept away in a few days by the Russian military or even by the threat of Russian military action. And there Russia would be as a legislator of European security with all kinds of new options and openings. That didn't come to pass. And I'll just conclude on this note. I don't know by what practical means Putin can make himself the legislator of European security in 2024, 2025, or 2026. But by my assessment, the ambition is still there. So we do need, I couldn't agree more, to think about what all of this means for Ukraine. But no less do we need to think about what all of this means for Europe.
Okay, well, thank you very much.